Hello, everyone. This is Laurie Boyer, and today I am visiting with Dr. Rob Johansson. He is the Director of Economics and Policy Analysis with the American Sugar Alliance. And Rob, or Dr. Johansson, I want to talk more about the Alliance and the organization and some of the things you deal with. But before we jump into that, let's get to know you a little bit better. Tell us about yourself and your background.
Hey, Laurie. Well, thanks so much for having me on the show. It's a real pleasure to be here and to chat with you and your audience. So I've been at the American Sugar Alliance now for about 7 months. I left the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where I had been for a number of years, at the end of January of this year. So it's a new role for me, a new organization. When I was at the Department of Agriculture, I was chief economist in my last role there. So over the past 6 years or so, I was helping with the rollout of a variety of programs that your listeners probably remember. The market facilitation program, a lot of the CFAP programs, but also dealing with the floods that we saw in 2019, and of course now we've got hurricane and drought issues. We can talk about those in a little bit because they really are affecting the sugar producers in the United States. But yeah, so I was at I served at the department for a number of years. And prior to that, I went to the University of Minnesota, where I got my PhD in agricultural economics. Grew up in Minnesota, but I did have a chance to spend a couple years abroad before heading off to Washington to work in agricultural economics. I got my undergraduate degree at Northwestern University in Chicago, and then I went to Peace Corps for about 4.5 years, where I worked with rural farmers in Africa, building fish ponds and working on integrated agricultural products in the early 1990s. And then following that, I went to Washington to work for USDA, and had an opportunity to do some work with the Office of Management and Budget, the Congressional Budget Office, as well as the the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House. So I've had a good time in Washington, but do have a lot of experience as well working with farmers, and it's a real pleasure to be back with the American Sugar Alliance, working with producers again. It's nice to get out and visit and hear about the challenges they're facing, but we can get into more about the ASA in a second. Let me just stop there and see if you have any follow-ups on any background information.
No, I don't have any follow-up questions. I do, listening to you speak, I can see how valuable you are to this organization because you're so well-rounded. Not only do you know how this particular industry works, but you have probably dealt with all of the ag industries, at least to some extent, and how they work, and just have that kind of overall picture on the back end of trade and economics from the government standpoint. And then, of course, now that you're back into the private sector, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it is great. It's nice to have that broader perspective. Certainly at the USDA, being chief economist, we, of course, put out every month, the WASD, the World Ag Supply and Demand Estimates that you're familiar with. So I did get a good background and situation and outlook for all of the commodities, and obviously played a large role in looking at trade policies as well as other domestic policies that affected, livestock producers all the way down to specialty crop producers of fruits and vegetables. So I got a good background in a lot of different areas. I should point out that my predecessor, Jack Roney, just retired. He was in the director role here at the American Sugar Alliance for over 25 years. So he had a real ability to know the history of sugar policy and the program and where it came from, that I'm still really learning a lot about. When you move from all commodities to one commodity, you realize how many nuances and how many details are involved with understanding how certain programs were set up the way they were. So I'm really enjoying that aspect too of the job, getting to learn about the new new programs and the background that led to them. But I am fortunate to have a good team of folks both from the sugar beet side as well as from the sugar cane side to help me come on board and to transition into this role.
Let's talk about the American Sugar Alliance now. Tell us more about this organization, the overreaching goals, what you do.
Sure. Well, the ASA, or the American Sugar Alliance, again, not to be confused with the American Soybean Association, was formed in 1983. It's a non-for-profit, and it's sort of an umbrella organization, represents all aspects of the U.S. sugar industry. Of course, the sugar policy oftentimes becomes a controversial political issue. So having one organization that represents all the sort of corners of the U.S. industry and to sort of tell our story from one viewpoint is really important. We found out that there's a real strength in being unified and to provide a single message and representation to deliver that message effectively. I'll give you one small part of that story. We know that just comparing American sugar producers to other global producers of sugar, both cane and beet across the globe, we know that U.S. Farmers are very efficient, and they do have to also meet very high standards of environmental, consumer, and worker protections. And so we know that the American sugar producer can compete against foreign producers on a level playing field. But of course, one of the reasons why we have discussions about sugar policy every year is that a lot of those global producers are subsidizing their sugar production, and we see those surplus sugar stocks being dumped on the world market, which, of course, that depresses global prices, and we often hear that the U.S. price is above the global price. But these are the kind of things that I spend my time working on and trying to explain to both the public and members of Congress. But again, a membership in ASA includes the farmers, the processors, and the refiners of sugar beets and sugar cane, and it's governed by the beet and cane organizations that make up the sugar industry. So we mainly have 4 larger associations that are members. American Sugar Beet Growers Association, and they represent the 10,000 sugar beet farmers across 11 states in the here in the continental United States. We have the U.S. Sugar Beet Association, which represents the 9 sugar cooperatives, which operate 22 factories in those 11 states that process sugar beet into sugar. Then we've got the Florida Sugarcane Leagues, and they represent Florida's sugarcane companies, as well as the Rio Grande Valley Sugar Growers, which is a member-owned co-op in Texas, their mills and refineries across the U.S. And finally, the American Sugarcane League, which represents the Louisiana sugarcane growers and processors, including the 11 raw sugar factories and more than 17,000 employees. So that's who makes up ASA. And essentially, as I mentioned, we bring together one voice and a unified voice and message on where policy is, why it's necessary to have that policy to keep U.S. sugar production sustainable moving forward. The ASA brings all those aspects of the industry together. We collaborate and share information amongst ourselves. We often are discussing heavily on how to approach different topics. But certainly we ASA serves as a clearinghouse and a sort of mission control for the American sugar sector.
I want to go back when you mentioned sometimes it's controversial. Can you tell me a little bit more about why that is, what you mean by that?
Oh, sure. You think about, for example, most commodities in the U.S. are export oriented. So we're always looking to, for example, find new access for our beef, in Asia, for example, or find new buyers of corn and soybeans across the globe. Sugar, on the other hand, we are an importer. We're the 3rd largest importer of sugar in the world. So we import a good amount of our sugar. In fact, we meet our WTO and our free trade agreements, and that essentially means, as well as our suspension agreements with Mexico, that means that we bring in about 25 to 30% of our sugar from outside the U.S., and the rest of the sugar that's produced is produced from U.S. sugarcane and sugar beets in the U.S. So again, because, as I mentioned earlier, other countries are, as part of their rural development policy, heavily subsidizing their sugar production, because they don't have other policy means to do so. That results in those countries oftentimes such producing surplus sugar that needs to be sold at the lowest price in the global market. Their domestic sugar prices are much higher than what they're selling those stocks on the world market. So oftentimes you'll see, for example, in the U.S., sugar companies complaining that they can't access more of that global sugar at lower prices compared to having to buy sugar in the United States at a higher price. So that's what I mean by it gets controversial. As I pointed out earlier, U.S. sugar producers are able to compete on a level playing field, but we know it's not a level playing field just because of those global subsidies. We are a large importer. We do bring in a lot of sugar at those global prices. Almost 30% of our sugar is sourced from foreign producers. But we also do know that we've got a vibrant and sustainable sugar sector in the United States, sugar beet and sugar cane, producing roughly half and half of the domestic sugar supply. That is, as I mentioned, very efficient, and also does meet very high labor and environmental and social standards, labor standards. So we want to make sure that our producers are not being unfairly targeted by foreign subsidies and having to compete against those relatively cheap dumped sugar supplies in the global market.
Okay, thank you for that. I appreciate that. That was helpful.
Sure.
Which now leads us to some of the current things you're working on. What are some of the current issues and even projects, if you will, that you're working on? And I know you've been there a few months, but kind of picking up the lead and running with right now.
Yeah, no, it's there's a lot going on. It seems like both obviously in the U.S. ag economy, which I continue to follow and to brief our members on, but also specific to sugar. So let me talk about a couple of those. With the new administration coming in, President Biden enacted an executive order on America's supply chains. As a result, one thing that USDA did, one thing that Secretary Vilsack did, was put out a request for information on America's supply chains for agriculture. So sugar, the U.S. sugar industry was able to meet the challenges of the pandemic last year. At the same time, the industry had just seen a very short beet crop in 2019, as well as a short sugarcane crop in Louisiana and Mexico. So we took some time to respond to that request for information, to point out how American sugar producers provide just-in-time delivery for their customers, which provides a huge savings to those customers and convenience, and was able to do so under very, very difficult conditions, both from the pandemic perspective, but also from that short crop perspective. So that was, something that we spent a good amount of time working on this year, just noting that and trying to make sure that the administration understood the importance of how the U.S. sugar industry was able to do that, given the program that's in place right now. Similar to the supply chain discussion that we spent telling in that response for information. Right now in the U.S., as you know, we just had Hurricane Ida come through Louisiana that affected a lot of our growers down there. USDA is going to be putting out its updated WASDE here at the end of the week, and so we'll see what the estimates are for the damage that was done to the cane crop down in Louisiana. Initial forecasts indicate that only between 20 to 25% of the crop down there that was affected. So we'll still have a decent harvest, but of course those producers were affected by, just like everybody was down there, by the very challenging conditions due to the hurricane. And we're fortunate that nobody was injured, and that all of the facilities are coming back up to speed as the power comes on. So again, that's something, just the day-to-day that we're working through, making sure that we're on top of what's going on in different parts of the United States with respect to growing conditions and different events that are happening. Another one, as you're probably familiar with in Colorado, is the mega drought that's affecting the northern Great Plains right now. Again, that's affecting all producers, but certainly the large number of acres of planted to sugar beets in the Red River Valley in Minnesota and North Dakota are being affected by that drought, as well as some of the growers that we have in the middle part of the state and the southern part of the state of Minnesota, as well as North Dakota. So those growers are dealing with that mega drought right now. It's been a little spotty in terms of how much rainfall those beets have been getting. And so again, this is a situation where we're continually monitoring how the harvest looks. It's farmers are just starting to pull those beets up there for the coming harvest campaign. So we'll watch that, and that will give us an indication of how much domestic production we're likely to see this year. And that factors heavily into how USDA views the amount of additional sugar sugar access that's provided to foreign exporters. So USDA does a very good job of surveying our companies and our producers to understand what production looks like. So that's one of the things, that's sort of the day-to-day that we're constantly going through. Of course, you don't often have to deal with a hurricane and a mega drought at the same time. And those things persist and continually affect the markets. And so, my job is to stay on top of that and to be hopefully able to explain to our producers what's going on with the economy, as well as explaining things to folks in the government and on the Hill as to how our producers are managing. It's really important to stress, there are policies that are out there, such as crop insurance, that let producers manage that weather risk. But it's also important to have, for producers to be able to count on, the USDA's Farm Bill programs that allow sugar production to occur. They know how much production they're going to be able to plant for next year, as well as, what a reasonable range of prices to be expected will be. And then they can invest in equipment and technology to help them deal with these challenging changes in climate that we've been seeing lately. So again, those are just things that I like to keep on top of. Let me just mention, just on the trade front, we talked a little bit about this, this controversy or controversial actions regarding the different price that you see in the U.S. versus the global markets. And one thing that we've promoted is what zero for zero legislation. So we're constantly monitoring certainly what Congress is doing, and if they're considering any kind of change to sugar policy, both positive or negative. And one thing that we've been working on with some of folks on the Hill is this zero for zero legislation that sort of acknowledges that the U.S. or the global sugar market being one of the most distorted commodity markets there is, because of the sort of large number and large levels of foreign subsidies and market interventions that result in dumping. Again, that's the main reason for why we have the policies we have. And as I mentioned, the U.S. is already a very large importer of sugar, the third largest. But the policy does enable, America's producers to be, as efficient as they can to contribute to the food security of our country, provide for that just-in-time delivery. But we would certainly be willing to consider changing that policy once, other countries sort of bring down their distortionary interventions in the global market. So the zero for zero approach, and you can see that in some legislation that's been recently introduced by Congresswoman Kamek from Florida and Congressman Kildee from Michigan. If foreign countries give up their production and trade distorting subsidies, the U.S. will also give up its sugar policy. So again, that's something that we continue to work on. We would like to see the global market in sugar be reformed, but it's a long way from occurring. So again, just emphasizing the need for our current program to remain intact until we see those reforms occur on the global market. And then lastly, again, that we continually look at how the U.S. sugar market is operating, both in terms of prices and in terms of our customers. So oftentimes sweetener users, food companies, for example, claim that U.S. sugar policy is raising the U.S. sugar price, and that somehow that's contributing to difficult times for those companies, and that A, they're either losing jobs, or B, that they're looking to move overseas to produce. And so we look into those claims seriously to see how much evidence there is for those claims. And one thing we've noted is oftentimes when sugar prices do move up or down, we don't see those sweetener user companies changing their prices. We notice that generally prices for candy and confectionaries are rising even when sugar prices are coming down. And in fact, we've seen prices fall by about almost 40% since 2010 in real terms for sugar, for wholesale sugar in the United States. But we note that consumers aren't really seeing the benefit of that. Certainly, both grocery stores have not lowered their retail prices for sugar to that degree, and certainly candy and confectionery and bakeries have not lowered the prices for their products to reflect that lower cost of input. Now that's understandable. It's because those companies need to spend a lot of money on labor, on energy, on marketing, on transportation. It's not, we've noted that sugar is a very small component of even though they're our customers, they're still a small component of their product that those companies are putting out. And those, whether it's labor laws or energy prices or shipping costs, those are a much bigger determinant of the cost of a food item, or a determination to outsource production to a Canadian or a Mexican company. So again, those are other items that we're continually working on. We've certainly, like to see U.S. companies flourish, and we know that the sugar-using companies for example, on the stock exchange have surpassed the S&P index by more than 170%. So they're doing well, and that's good for us because that means that they're selling lots of products to their clients and their consumers, and that means they're buying a lot of our products. So that's a good thing. But sometimes if they point to us as being a reason for why their profits aren't even higher, we just like to ground truth that a little bit, and make sure that those arguments aren't being completely distorted by some of the folks that are making them. At any rate, I'll stop there. Those are some of the things that we're working on, and certainly happy to answer any questions you might have.
I think the only question that I had in there, and that was going back more towards the supply chain and even in trade. I just wanted to ask you, like, how did COVID factor into the supply chain, since many of the ag industries have had a backlog or processing issues, labor issues, things like that? How did the sugar industry, I'm used to saying sugar beets because that's what we have in Colorado. How did that fare? How did COVID work into the sugar industry? How did you fare through that?
Sure. Obviously COVID affected the whole supply chain for agricultural products in a lot of different ways. So we can talk a little bit about aspects of that. But the biggest one for sugar, and you probably remember this back in March or April of last year, when COVID really led to complete shutdown of a lot of the restaurants and other hotel industry chains. We saw a huge change in consumer purchasing habits for food. Normally the U.S. consumer or household spends about half of their well, let's put it this way: of all the food that's purchased in America, about half the dollars are going to restaurants and other institutions, and about half are going to grocery stores. Now that changed dramatically during COVID. We saw a huge swing to grocery store purchases as consumers stocked up or worried a little bit about supplies. I think we saw some hoarding behavior occur with some ag products. But by and large, consumers stayed home and cooked a lot at home and baked a lot at home. And so we saw a big change in our demand moving from, from our industrial purchasers or our bigger, our bigger companies to both service the consumer demand directly in grocery stores, but also for companies, food companies that were producing baked goods, for example, for grocery store purchases. So it entailed a lot of moving pieces for our producers, for our processing and refining companies to repackage what normally would be big bulk shipments that were being sent to some of those larger industrial consumers to smaller bags, whether 50-pound bags or 10-pound bags, or even 4-pound bags that you see on the grocery store shelf. So we saw a big shift in that. As an example, between that March and May period in 2020, we switched and added about almost 53 million more 4-pound bags to meet consumer needs in grocery stores. And as a result, we saw empty grocery store shelves, but not empty of sugar. We saw generally ample supply of sugar in most grocery stores throughout the pandemic. But it did require, a fairly swift and nimble shift in processing and packaging. So that was one effect. Now, in terms of the employee side, of course, COVID affected employees across the country, and labor is an issue for all food manufacturers and as well as food processors. But because over the years, both sugar beet processors as well as sugarcane refineries have put a lot of investment into upgrading and modernizing their facilities, there's a lot of robotics and a lot of mechanization that has gone on in those facilities, and the folks that are working in those facilities are by and large managing computer run processes, and they can do that from areas that are not like you would see in, for example, a meat packing plant. They're not right next door to their their colleagues. Now that didn't happen in all cases. Certainly we had folks that did get sick, but it really didn't affect overall operations. I think most facilities planned for hiring some additional staff to get through COVID and to run shifts in such a way to minimize the risk of exposure to their employees. So again, I think we sort of point to this past year, this pandemic, as sort of a real highlight for the sugar industry, because we didn't have supply chain issues. And at the same time, we're managing this, as I mentioned earlier, the beet crop in 2019 certainly had been severely affected by an early freeze that we saw in that Red River Valley area of Minnesota. So our beet crop was down, and some of those customers had to find new supplies of sugar from other suppliers, whether that were other beet processors or cane refiners. So we did see some shifting of supplies going on related more to the supply side than to the demand side. But by and large, the just-in-time delivery that we sort of pride ourselves on, make sure that our customers don't have to invest in large storage facilities. We store all the sugar until they need it, and then we send it to them so that they get it just when they need it to put it into their products. Now, one thing I have heard, and just put a small caveat on this, when we talk to some of those clients, they have noted that, because they were affected by COVID, their demand shifted as well. They had to slow down a little bit on their orders, which did help us sort of readjust. As I mentioned, we had to be nimble to meet this changing demand. We did do that. But I think it was happening at the same time as our customers were also having to adjust. So by and large, again, I don't know if that got to all the points of your question, but we did see a big shift in consumer demand. We're seeing it shift back now. Of course, sports stadiums are up, open again. We're seeing folks going to baseball games, hockey in the winter, obviously, but buying soda again. That's a big demander for sugar as well, soft drinks as well as concessions. So we're seeing a return to more normal purchasing behavior by the American consumer. Of course, we're continually watching the economy, how the Delta variant is affecting different parts of the U.S. economy, and how that's going to affect different parts of the egg economy. And those are the kinds of things that our producers want to know. But they're heading into harvest right now. They're dealing with weather, and so I think that's mainly what they have in their minds.
Perfect. Thank you. Answered that and more. All right. I don't have a lot of other questions today. I just appreciate your time and your thoroughness. Thank you very much. You make my job a lot easier when you really go into explaining things. I appreciate it.
Sure, Laurie. Well, listen, again, if you have any follow-ups, feel free to reach out. Happy to get on again. And it's really great to see you. And good luck with the, we just came out of Labor Day. I hope you had a good Labor Day weekend. I hope you've got some nice plans for the fall now.
Well, thank you. Hope you did too. Yeah. So I'll be back in touch, and I'll go back and put the end on this and mix it with my music and all that fun stuff. So thank you.
Yeah, great. I just hope I answered the questions without doing too many.
You did awesome. And I'll send you the final podcast once I get it all put together.
Excellent, Laurie. All right. Take care.
Thank you. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.